So when you start up Unity, what it's going to do is it's going to, at first actually oftentimes it will ask you for your email and a password. You can create an account with Unity if you want, and I can testify to the fact that they are not like an intrusive company. I've had students who created accounts for them for the video game design class that I teach. It's not a big deal. You can check, yes, I do want you to send me emails, or you can check no. But you can skip past that. And really what you're going to do is you're going to hit the new button, okay? You're going to hit the new button, and it's going to ask you what you want to do and where you want to save this new project. Now let me just say something. Unity uses a lot of files, okay? So it has to be contained in a folder. So you've got to make a new folder in your media students and to kind of hold all of this stuff. So you're going to just call it video game project or game project, and then your last name, and then your location. You're going to put it right here, video game, okay, just like that, okay? Select the folder, and then before you click create new project, okay, you're going to hit the button here. It says add asset packages, and you're going to click on that, and then you're going to basically add every single one that has an object in it. So cameras, characters, cross-platform input we do not need. That's for, I think that's like mobile, like, like tilt the phone, like kind of mobile stuff. We don't really need that. Effects, environment, particle systems, utilities, and vehicles, okay? You don't need prototyping, you don't need any of the others, okay? And once you do that, you click the done, and then you're going to add the asset package that's there, okay? Now, I'm actually not going to create a new project because it takes about 5 minutes, maybe a little less, to bring all those things in and save them to the folder. But once you're ready, you click Create Project. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to hit the Open button here. And there we go. This is the one that I created for my last class. There we go. Okay, so now I'm just going to delete this and kind of show you where we start. So this is kind of how it's going to start. And you'll probably see something a little bit like this. Let's delete that. And we'll delete that. Okay, and you're just going to start with, it's going to say untitled up here instead of scene 1 because you haven't saved a scene. And it's going to say main camera and directional light. And so that you're going to start out with a main camera and a directional light. And if I just kind of set this up, what it will look like is something along the lines of this. It's very disorienting at first. And the reason being, it's just there's nothing there to really look at. In fact, if I remember correctly, if you haven't ever used it before, you're like down here even more, and you may not even see the camera and the light. You may just be right down on the grid, okay? And it is very, very disorienting. So the first thing that we want to do to kind of help, for me to help orient ourselves and everything like that, is we're going to create a terrain. But before we do that, I just want to call your attention to Unity and how the program is laid out here. So first off, obviously we have our three-dimensional world in the scene window. We'll also talk about the game window in a little bit. And we have an animation window here. We're probably not even going to get to that in this project, but it's good to know that that's there. Then over here we have a whole series of tabs, inspector, lighting. Some of these will open up, some of these will not. The inspector will definitely open up. I think lighting you have to add yourself. I don't remember if navigation I added that myself or not. It remembers the way I work. And then down here is your project. And the project is actually really important. It'll look like this. It'll just have 2 folders that are in the assets folder here. And then I obviously already created a scene, which is the scene that we're in here. And I also created a terrain, which I can delete now. You've got editor and standard assets as 2 folders. And we'll deal with the standard assets. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to go to game object, and I'm going to go to 3D object, and I'm going to add myself a terrain. Now it just kind of pops in. You may not even see it. It's like, where did it go? It's kind of frustrating sometimes. Well, there's a really handy little trick that Unity has that you should learn right now and memorize, and that is over here in the hierarchy, everything that's in your video game will be listed, okay? And I can click on something, and then if I hover over my mouse over the 3D window and hit the F key, it zooms to that object and kind of allows it to be centered in the window. Now, to move around like I'm doing is actually really simple. To slide side to side or up and down, you click and press down the middle scroll button. So the scrolling wheel actually has a button. I don't know if you guys know that, but it does. And you can click the scroll button down, hold it, and then move side to side and around. Then, to rotate around objects, you can right-click and you can swivel the camera around its own axis. Now, this is a little different for those of you who might be used to working with, say, Blender or something like that. Blender, you can set it to swivel around objects, so the axis, like, it rotates around an object. I have yet to find out if that's an option in Unity. It might be, but I don't know. So you kind of just end up rotating and swiveling or sliding side to side an awful lot. Now, we've got a basic terrain. We've kind of worked on how we can move around. One other thing to kind of keep in mind is you can see the 3 axes up here in the corner. This kind of helps keep you keep track of where you are. Unity works in a way that's, it's very interesting how 3D programs work. Some of them are what we call Z up and others are Y up. And what I mean by that is, in Unity, you've got X, okay, here, which is going in this direction. You can see the red arrow, okay. Z goes horizontally in the other direction, okay, and then Y goes vertically. In other 3D programs like Blender, Z is up and it's X and Y, which for some reason I just like that better. It makes more sense to my brain that X and Y are horizontal and Z is vertical. But actually most 3D animation programs are not like that. Most 3D animation programs, Y is up. But it's just kind of important to understand what you're doing because you can get disoriented rather quickly. So now what we're going to do is, if we left click on the terrain, you go over to the inspector and you can see a whole bunch of options about your terrain. And we want to make it bigger. Now, when I first started in Unity, the first thing I started doing is I would try to make the terrain bigger in scale here. That's actually a mistake. By making it bigger in scale like that, you actually can mess up your textures, you can mess up all sorts of stuff. So we don't want to do that. What we want to do is go over here, there's a series of buttons, and right here is a little gear. We're going to click on that gear and it opens up a whole series, I mean like a whole ton of options for height, width, resolution, all sorts of really technical stuff. We're not going to go for all of that, but if we go right here under width and length, I find that if you're just going to use one terrain for a video game, making it 1,000 by 1,000 works quite nicely. And we can click, I can hit the F key again, and it centers me and kind of puts me out on the terrain. Now, that's rather boring because it's just plain old white. It doesn't really give us a sense of where we are. If I were to drop the player character on here and we would walk around, it would actually be very disorienting because it's just white. There's no texture, there's no definition, there's no three-dimensionality to it at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a texture to it first so that we have a little sense of what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the brush here, and there are no textures that have been defined yet. You can literally paint textures on this thing. It's really kind of cool. So I'm going to go to Edit Textures. There's no textures, so the only thing I can do is add one. This makes a lot of sense. When you click Add, it's going to pop up this little window, and this is where things get a little bit confusing, or at least not confusing, but new. Okay? We have 2 boxes here. One is called albedo, okay, and smoothness, and the other is normal. Now, a normal image, what that means is has nothing to do with being normal or being strange. What that is actually the texture, the actual bump of a 3D object. A normals map is what we call normals, are the surface of a 3-dimensional object. So if I go here and I hit the select button, it's going to pop up another window, and in here you're going to see a whole bunch of textures. And so if I go to my favorite to start off with, which is the muddy rock, the mud rock here, you'll notice there's two. There's a texture here, and then here is a blue and reddish weird one. This is actually the normals, and you'll see it says mud rocky normals. So I'm going to double click on that. That is now inside the normals box. Then I can't actually click add yet because I need an albedo texture. So I'm going to hit select, and instead of clicking the mud rocky albedo, which is right here, I'm just going to get a gray tone really quickly, and then we'll change it in a second. But I want to show you what happens with the normals. So there's my gray. I click add, and the very first texture that you put on, okay, will go across the entire terrain. So now if I zoom in, you can see that rocky texture. And what's really cool is if I take my directional light and if I shift its position in the sky, that's not enough, -2000, still not enough. Maybe the rotation will help. Yeah, that's right, because it's a directional light, it's like far away, it doesn't really do anything. My rotation will help. So if I take my rotation and change it, you can see how the shadows change. You see how the shadows are going on different sides of the object? So a normals map, believe it or not, actually changes essentially the way a texture, you can see it changing here. That's actually better. The way a texture has shadows on it. It actually puts, basically, it's like fake bumps on a flat surface. So my surface here is actually completely flat, but the normals map gives it shadows, even though it's completely flat. So let's go back to our texture. So I'm going to left click on my terrain here, and then I'm going to go back, I'm going to click on the original texture. Let's go edit the texture, and instead of flat gray, I'm going to go back to the mud rocky albedo, which matches the normal. There we go, apply, and now you can see I've actually got a pretty cool mud rock kind of a texture that's on my terrain. And you can see that if I back up from it, it's a repeated texture. It's what we call seamless texture. So if I were to place my character on here, it's going to look very artificial. It's going to look like a repeated texture. There's a lot of ways that we can get around that. I'll deal with that in a second. But now what we can do is we can actually start to change our terrain and start giving it some three-dimensional form. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play with these three buttons right here. The first one is a lift terrain or a shrink terrain, essentially, lift or lower. And if I go over here, let's make the brush a little bit bigger. And I'm just on a regular circle brush. If I start to click, it starts to lift the terrain in certain areas. Now what's really interesting is if I roll underneath, the terrain is actually invisible, okay? That has to do with the way three-dimensional stuff does normals. But this object, your terrain object, is actually paper thin, okay? And so you only can see it from one side. But I can start making some mountains. Now, not all brushes are created equal. If I want to make like something that's really jagged, I've got a whole bunch of different brushes that I can use. Let's try this one. And you can see that I can start to create these little jagged mountains. I could go to a little bit of a smaller texture. I could do that, okay? The other thing that I can do is I can hold the Shift key down and I can make things lower. So if I hold the Shift key down, it's going to go lower and lower and lower. However, you can't go lower than the original base height. This is a problem if you want to do things like a lake or rivers or something like that. So let's say I wanted to do a lake. One of the things that I would then use is this second tool, which is a height matching tool. So I would say start a terrain here and start a little hill and say I want all of this to be the same height. And then I could subtract from that and make myself a little lake. So let's do that really quickly. So then I'll go to the Match Terrain tool. I'll go over to the top of this tool here and I'll hold the Shift key down and click once. and it will set the height of where I clicked. And now I let go of the Shift key and I just start painting. And you can see how it changes. The whole terrain becomes that same height. Okay? And if I want to do it really broadly, I take my opacity all the way up, my brush size all the way up, and I just start clicking. And I drag, and it makes everything the same height all the way to the edge. Okay, right here. And it's unfortunate, just going to do the whole thing. Okay? And if I want a little lake, I could leave a space in the middle or something like that. And we'll add water in just a second. Okay? Just to show you how that can be done. And you oftentimes need to like spin around so that you see everything. Okay, just be really mindful of that. And a lot of times I'll just do this. I'll set my terrain at a certain base level, and then I'll go back and I'll shrink or add things from there. So I'm just going to go here and just kind of take all this, and the slower you move, sometimes the better it works out. So now I've actually raised my terrain with the brush in almost all the areas. Just go right on the side here. And now I can go back to the original tool that I was using here. Oh, I can't get that corner until I swivel around. There we go. Get that corner's a little lower too. So now I can actually take this, go to the other one, hold the Shift key down, and I can start creating like a little spot for a lake. Okay? And then I'll go back over here and we'll do some more mountains. Okay? Now, the first thing that you might say is, okay, you know, that's great, Weiss-Road, but I don't see scale. I do not understand how big those hills are, how big are those mountains. And that would be an excellent, you know, question. Like, okay, I just made that. How big is that? So the next thing, after you kind of get started a little bit, the best thing to do before you go too far is we're going to add our player's characters so that we can see from the player's perspective how big these things really are. So you're going to go click on your assets in the project folder. You're going to, if you imported the character asset package, there will be standard assets, characters, first person controller, prefabs, and you're just going to drag the regular FPS controller out here and right onto the map. And what's going to happen is it's going to drop him in there. There he is. Want to see how big he is? Since he's selected, I'll just hit the F key. There he is. Okay? Now I'm going to grab the move tool, which is right here, and I'm going to drag him up because he's kind of like halfway in the terrain. We don't want that. Lift him up a little bit. And now I'm going to save. And if it's the first time you're saving, it's going to ask you to give your scene a name, and you call it Scene 1. Now let's hit the play button, and we can play our game. I'm like literally that far. So the first-person controller comes with all the controls that you might normally see in a first-person game. So WASD to move, so W to move forward, S to move backwards, A to move sideways, D to move the other way, and then mouse to change your view. Shift to run, space to jump. So now you can get a better sense of the scale and the scope of what I've built here. It's actually much bigger than you may have thought of first. Okay? Your character's pretty small. To get out of this mode, you hit the escape key, it gives you your mouse back, and you can hit the play button. The first thing I like to do is I like to make my controller a little bit bigger, so I'm going to take the scale and go 2 by 2 by 2, and then drag my character up. Now, that's a good start. Let's go, let's click on the terrain, hit the F key, back up a little bit, and now I can do some more work on my hills and whatnot to make it look a little bit better. Let's just do a couple things here that I want to show you. So I'll just do some kind of like really jaggedy stuff. Let's take the brush size down a little bit, make really like small jaggy stuff, you know, on the sides of the mountains. You know, I could take like this little smaller one and kind of make things look a little bit more natural by taking the brush size and the opacity down a little bit. So you really get to play with the way the brushes work. It's kind of cool how things can start to happen. You can see like this mountain, this hill is starting to look a lot more natural because it's not just a perfectly smooth little hill, you know. And some of these things are. And so maybe I like the rocky stuff here, but maybe I want grass and pasture in certain places. Okay. So now we're going to go back to our texture, and I'm going to add a new texture. So I'm going to add a new texture, and I'm going to select a new albedo, and I'm just going to click the grassy hill texture here. That doesn't have a normals map attached to it, so I'm just going to click, and I'm going to ignore the normals map and click add. Now I select it, and I can take my brush size up, and I can start painting a grassy texture right on top. And maybe I just want there to be like a path or something, so I can do a grassy texture here. And let's say I want it to fade out as it starts to go up into the mountains. That makes sense. So I'll take my opacity down really far, zoom in, and as I start to paint, you can see like along the edges, it kind of starts fading out into the muddy, rocky texture that I have. And I can just start really, creating different textures for different spaces. This is going to be our lake here, so maybe around the lake I want a sandy texture, so I'll do the grass here, okay, and you just keep going. And then so I'm going to go and add another texture, click on the albedo, and I'll find there is a sand albedo here, and then click add. One of the things that frustrates me about Unity is you have to, even though I just added a new texture, it stays on the original, so I actually have to click it and then start painting the sand. Yeah, question? Yes, you may. Okay, so you can do sand stuff here, and then one of the things you can do is again take the opacity up, hit it a little harder, maybe down here in the core, and then low opacity maybe around the edges to have it like smooth out into the grass. So maybe full opacity around here on the edges, get up towards the grass, and maybe start to fade out between the two. And you can see how that will work. And I'll just, low opacity, you can actually like layer them on top of each other. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to really help that repeated pattern from the character's perspective. It's going to help break that up a little bit, okay? So now let's add a little bit of water. So if I go back to my assets folder here in the project, I go back to my standard assets, there's a water folder here. No, there's not. Under environment, there's a water folder. We're going to go water 4 is the one that I like the best. We go to prefabs again. That means it's a prefabricated object, which is really nice. And I go to the advanced one, and I can just drag it right in here like this. Sink it down until it hits the thing. Now you've got a couple options. You can scale these because they're tileable, so that means that the edges match up, or you can scale it up. It doesn't really matter. Scaling it up does make the waves a little bit bigger, but hey, it all depends on what you wanna accomplish. So that looks pretty good. Let's scale it this way a little bit. Just make sure until it starts to disappear. Okay, let's play. Let's see how this looks. So first off, I'm going to save, and then I'm going to play. And that's a really good kind of thing to get used to. So now you can see how the grass is kind of overlaid over the rocks a little bit because the opacity was lower when I did that. Let's see if we can find our lake. I think it's over here. I think I see sand. I'm running with the Shift key held down so I can move a little faster. You can still see a little bit of the repeated patterns there, so I would want to continue work on my texture to make sure that that doesn't happen. But then we start getting into the sandy parts, and it looks pretty good. Pretty cool. Okay, yeah, now that's the disappointing part about this prefab object. Notice that the rocky texture is still there, is that it doesn't look all that great from underneath. Okay, and you could add code to swim if you wanted to, but you know what? That's a totally different demo, different day, different whatever. And you can kind of see, look at those rocks over here. This rocky area looks really good. Okay, I mean, like it's starting to really come about. The environment is starting to look unique and different. And I really recommend that when you're doing this, you take your character and you bring them up to different places, and you make them walk in and see what's going on in certain areas. The other thing that's really important to understand, escape, unplay, is your edges of your map. So I'm going to take my player object here. I'm not going to scale. I'm going to drag my player object over here so we're a little closer to the edge. And let's just take a look at this. So, I mean, if I go over here and I look towards the edge, I think I'm going the right direction. Yeah, that's not something that's really great for a video game, just seeing the edge of the world, right? You know, I guess some of those people on Twitter who think the world is still flat would probably be very pleased with this, but we've got, you know, we don't want to do this. And beyond that, I'm going to back up. Uh-oh. And you will just keep on falling forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. So escape. So what you want to do is along your edges, what I really highly recommend is click on your terrain and then grab this, take the opacity really high, and I recommend pretty high mountains along the edges of your map, at least to obscure the edge. And then what we'll do is we can set up a collider, which is essentially like a little force field basically, to keep your character from being able to climb those mountains. And then you've got basically the edge of your map here, and your person can't see, you know, beyond those mountains so that they can't literally see the edge of the world. Does that make sense to everybody? You know why you would want to do something like that? Or you could do the opposite, and let's say over here, I can hold the shift key down, I'll make this go down, and then I might add water objects all across here so it looks like you've hit the beach and there's the ocean. And then I would again put my little force fields in there, my colliders, so that the person couldn't start walking through the ocean and end up falling off the map again, okay? So you want to, you know, that's important stuff to kind of think about. But I mean, look at this. In just about 20 minutes of talking here, which means I would be able to do it a lot faster, I've created a pretty decent world. You know, I mean, it's not awesome. There's no buildings or anything that really would make it look really good. But I've created a pretty decent world that my character can walk around in. I've got a video game started just like that. I mean, it really is pretty easy. So, so now one of the things that you know, you could start playing with is again, you know, maybe you don't like the way, this is the third tool here. Maybe you don't like how this is like really spiky and you want it to be like a little smoother. It looks weird, you know. So the third tool for terrain editing here, this is the smoothing tool. And so as I click on it, you see it takes these little bumps and it starts to smooth them out. And it starts to make them a little bit more rounded, a little less spiky, okay? It does lower them a little bit, so be mindful of that, but it can actually be really helpful to make things look a little bit more natural. Especially if, let's say, around the lake, a lot of times you might have really jagged edges if you were really harsh about something. Like, let's say I take this, boom, and then I take the opacity way up high, and I just do this, okay? Sometimes that edge might be a little harsher than you want, so you can take the smoothing tool and you can just start to smooth it out, which is really kind of nice to be able to do that sort of a thing. It works out really well. You know, you can go too far too with it, but it's a really good tool to use that. Does that make sense to everybody? We're not going to talk about trees or anything like that, but you have enough time. The first thing that you want to do is create the scene or create the game. The last thing that I really want to mention is everything that's in the game needs to be contained inside the folder. So if I right click on this and say Show and Explorer, this is inside a folder that's Video Game Project, and it's got all the things that I need are in this folder. If you take anything and move it out of this folder, it disappears from the game basically, okay? It'll wreck everything. It wrecks tons of stuff. So that's where you need to be very careful and mindful as you're creating objects or putting things into the game. You never ever move anything in Windows Explorer. You only ever move things inside the Assets folder here in the project window. If you keep to that rule, then you'll be fine, because you can only then move things within the game folder anyway, and so you would never be able to misplace something. Does this kind of make sense? I'm trying to think if I forgot anything about the terrain building, but I don't think so. You must work with multiple textures, okay, or else it will look awful. You've got to have more than one texture on there. You can download your own textures. The important thing to do is make sure that they're tileable or seamless textures, as they call them. So let's say I wanted to find an ice texture, okay? If I'm Googling that, I would go ice texture, and see how seamless is an option? I'm going to select that. And it needs to be a square texture, but I could literally take this, download it, put it into my assets folder in Unity, and then it will appear in that window when you click Edit Textures. Let's try. Let's just do that. So I'm going to click View Image. There we go. It's got a watermark on it, which drives me nuts, but that's okay. Media Staff, Weisbrod, Video Game, Weisbrod. I've got a double folders. Assets. So I'm going to put it in the Assets, and then you know what? I'll make a new folder that just says My Textures, so that I know where they go. Okay, boom, boom, and then save it in there. Now what's cool is, go back into Unity. See, Unity was thinking there for a second. It added the folder My Textures. There's my texture. So if I click on my terrain, go back to my brush, edit texture, add a new one, select the albedo, there it is. Double click, click add, and now I can start painting an ice texture. Whoops, I'm not, see, I did it again. It always is still on the original texture. So I click on that, I can start painting an ice texture. See that? It's kind of cool. Let's hit play and see what it looks like. Sometimes you got to run far, distances. That looks pretty cool. All right, except it's really repeatable, so we'd have to work on that a little bit. And it's got that rocky normals to it, so there's some issues with that. I started with the normals texture, and now it's actually kind of biting me in the rear end here. Starting with a normals texture might not have been the best thing. So anyway, now let me say this too. If you, let's see, where's my first-person controller? I want to find out where he is. All right, so let's say my first-person controller is right here, and then I'm editing my texture, okay? And I lift this section. Whoops! Wow, that was really powerful. And I lift this section where the first-person controller is. What do you guess is going to happen now if I just hit play? He's not in it. He's under it, and so he's just going to start falling. See? Okay? Because the terrain, like I said, is paper thin. So if you do that, always check where your first-person controller is. Hit F. Oh, wait. See, you can totally tell he's underneath. So then I get the Move tool, grab the green arrow, and bring it up until you see the little green capsule show up. Okay? That little green capsule kind of gives you, that's the collider for the body. That's the collision detector that interacts with the terrains and everything else. So now, if I hit play, I'll drop very quickly, and then I'm on the side of the hill. You can climb up vertical faces by hitting the space bar and jumping up a face. I can see my house from here. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody got a good sense of how this starts? Okay, so tomorrow we're going to start these. See what happens.